Most men don't miss opportunities because they lack value. They miss them because they're looking for the wrong kind of signal. By the time a man reaches his 40s or 50s, he has learned to respect clarity. In business, in friendships, in life, direct communication is efficient and clean. You say what you mean, you act with intention, and you expect others to do the same. So when it comes to attraction, many men carry that same expectation forward. If she's interested, she'll make it obvious. If she's not, she won't. But that assumption quietly works against you, because attraction, especially from a woman who is emotionally aware and socially calibrated, rarely announces itself in a direct, unmistakable way, not because she's playing games, but because overt clarity carries risk. It exposes her. It removes the buffer of deniability. And most women, particularly those who have experience, prefer to feel safe before they feel seen. So instead of direct signals, what often shows up is something softer. She stays a little longer than necessary. She keeps the conversation open when it could have ended. She lingers in proximity without a clear reason. Nothing about it feels dramatic. Nothing about it demands your attention. And that's exactly why it gets missed. You've been trained to look for green lights that are unmistakable. What you're actually getting are quiet openings that require interpretation. And here's where the misread happens. A man sees ambiguity and assumes neutrality. He tells himself, if she were interested, she'd make it clear. So he does nothing. He stays polite, contained, respectful. He exits the moment cleanly, believing he handled it well. From his perspective, there was nothing to act on. From her perspective, something was offered and not received. This is not about mind reading or chasing signals that aren't there. It's about recognizing that absence of clarity is not the same as absence of interest. In many cases, ambiguity is the signal. It's a space being held open, waiting to see if you can step into it without needing certainty handed to you first. What makes this difficult is that experience can actually make you more cautious. You've had enough interactions to know that misreading a situation can cost you. Socially, emotionally, even professionally. So you default to restraint. You wait for confirmation. You avoid assumption. That instinct protects you, but it also blinds you to nuance. Because subtle interest does not feel like certainty. It feels like possibility. And if you're only calibrated to act when something is obvious, you will consistently miss the moments that require a bit more awareness, a bit more presence. What appears passive on the surface is often structured that way intentionally. Not to confuse you, but to filter for something specific. The ability to notice without being told. The ability to move without being pushed. And once you start to see that, the entire interaction changes. What most men call coincidence is often quiet intention expressed in a language they were never taught to read. Lingering is one of those behaviors that gets dismissed because it doesn't fit the model of direct communication. A woman doesn't say she's interested. She doesn't make a clear move. She simply stays. A little longer than necessary, a little closer than expected, a little more available than the situation requires. On the surface, it feels insignificant, easy to explain away, easy to ignore. But human behavior, especially in social and emotional contexts, is rarely random. A woman who is comfortable leaving will leave. A woman who is disengaged will find a reason to exit. People protect their time and energy, particularly as they get older. So when someone remains present without a clear external reason, that presence itself becomes the signal. The mistake many men make is assuming that if interest is real, it will come in a form that is undeniable. Clear words, obvious flirting, something that removes all doubt. But for many women, especially those who have developed social awareness and emotional intelligence, directness is not always the preferred first move. It carries exposure. It shifts the dynamic too quickly. It places her in a position where rejection becomes public rather than private. So instead, she communicates through availability. She lingers in conversation even after the natural endpoint has passed. She doesn't rush to check her phone or create distance. She allows pauses to exist without filling them, which gives you space to step in. She stays physically within your orbit, not closing the interaction, not escalating it, but holding it in place. This is not indecision, it's calibration. She is feeling out the moment, but she's also feeling out you. Not through questions or declarations, but through observation. Will you notice the space she's leaving open, or will you require her to close the gap for you? Will you remain passive, Or will you take a step that gives direction to something that is currently undefined? To a man who expects direct signals, this can feel frustrating or even meaningless. It doesn't give him enough to act on with certainty, and that's the point. Lingering is not designed to remove uncertainty. It's designed to reveal how you handle it. Because in real interactions, especially at a mature stage of life, attraction is not just about interest, it's about how that interest is managed. A woman is not only asking herself if she is drawn to you, she is also observing whether you can take something subtle and give it shape without forcing it. This is where many opportunities quietly dissolve. The man interprets her presence as politeness. He assumes she is simply being friendly, or that she has nowhere else to be. He waits for something more concrete, something that confirms what he already suspects, but does not want to risk being wrong about. And while he waits, the moment loses its energy. The openness closes, the interaction ends without anything actually happening. From the outside, nothing went wrong. From the inside, something was never picked up. Once you begin to understand lingering as communication rather than coincidence, the dynamic shifts. It stops being about guessing and starts being about recognizing patterns of presence that carry meaning. And recognition on its own is not where this ends. What feels like a quiet moment is often a decision point that defines how you are perceived. When a woman lingers, she is not just staying. She's creating a space where something could happen without forcing it to happen herself. That space carries a subtle pressure. Not urgency, not demand, but expectation. And what fills that space is not her words, it is your response to it. Many men believe that waiting is the safe option, that if they hold back, observe, and avoid misreading the situation, they are maintaining control. It feels measured, it feels respectful, it feels like maturity. But in these moments, waiting is not neutral. It communicates something, whether you intend it to or not. It communicates hesitation. Not the kind that comes from thoughtfulness, but the kind that comes from needing certainty before taking action. And certainty in this context is rarely offered up front. So what you are really communicating is that you require reassurance before you move, that you are more comfortable reacting than initiating. To a woman who is paying attention, that matters, because leadership in this dynamic is not about dominance or control, it is about direction. The ability to take an undefined moment and give it a clear, grounded next step. Not aggressively, not performatively, but with a kind of calm decisiveness that shows you are comfortable moving things forward without needing permission spelled out for you. This is where lingering becomes a test, but not in the manipulative sense people often assume. It is a filter. She's observing whether you can recognize an opening that is not explicitly labeled, whether you can tolerate a small amount of uncertainty without freezing or overthinking, whether you can move in a way that feels natural, not forced, not delayed. And this is where many men, especially those who have become more cautious over time, find themselves stuck. Experience has taught you that missteps have consequences. You have seen how quickly a moment can turn awkward. You have learned to read the room, to be socially aware, to avoid overstepping. All of that is valuable, but it also creates a tendency to wait for clarity that removes all risk. That clarity rarely comes, so the moment sits there, open but not progressing. You stay composed but inactive. She stays present but unengaged beyond a certain point. And eventually, the interaction resolves itself without anything actually being decided. Not because there was no interest, but because there was no direction. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. But something did happen. A role was offered, and it wasn't taken. This is the part that often goes unacknowledged. Missed moments are rarely random. They are usually the result of a quiet hesitation at the exact point where something needed to move. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just forward. And when that movement doesn't come, the signal is just as clear as if it had. Hesitation at this stage of life rarely comes from ignorance. It comes from memory. By the time you reach your late 30s, 40s, or beyond, you are no longer operating on instinct alone. You are carrying years of interactions, outcomes, and quiet recalibrations. You have seen what happens when timing is off, when interest is misread, when confidence is misplaced. And over time, those experiences don't just inform you, they shape your thresholds. You become more careful with where you step, That caution has value. It keeps you from impulsive behavior, from reading fantasy into ordinary interactions, from putting yourself in situations that feel unnecessary or draining. But there is a point where caution stops being discernment and starts becoming avoidance. And it rarely announces itself as fear. It presents as control. You tell yourself you're being measured, that you're choosing not to act because the signal isn't strong enough, because the context isn't ideal, because you don't need to force anything. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. It aligns with the identity of a man who has learned from experience. But underneath that reasoning, there is often something quieter, a reluctance to risk being wrong again. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, almost private way. The small social misreads, the moments where you stepped forward and it wasn't received, the slight shift in energy that told you had gone a bit too far. Those moments accumulate, and instead of processing them fully, many men adapt by narrowing their range of action. They wait for cleaner signals, safer situations, interactions where the outcome feels more predictable. The problem is, real attraction rarely operates inside those conditions. So what happens is not that opportunities disappear. It's that your criteria for acting becomes so tight that most of those opportunities no longer qualify. You begin to move less, not because there is less to respond to, but because your internal filter has become more restrictive. And from the outside, it looks like composure. You're calm, you're not chasing, you're not overextending yourself. But internally, there is a quiet pattern forming. Moments pass where something could have been explored, and instead they are contained. Not rejected, not mishandled, just left untouched. Over time, that has a cost, not just in missed connections, but in how you start to relate to these situations altogether. You begin to assume that nothing was really there to begin with, that your restraint is simply a reflection of reality, not a factor shaping it. And that assumption reinforces the same pattern going forward. This is how hesitation becomes self-confirming. It protects you from immediate discomfort, but it also removes you from the very experiences that would recalibrate your sense of timing and presence. And without that recalibration, the gap between what you perceive and what is actually available continues to widen, which is why the shift required here is not about becoming more aggressive or less thoughtful. It's about redefining what it means to lead in a way that doesn't rely on certainty to begin. There is a version of leadership that feels loud, forceful, and performative. Most experienced men have already rejected it. It looks like overconfidence, rehearsed lines, or unnecessary pressure. It doesn't fit who you are, and more importantly, it doesn't respect the reality of how people connect at this stage of life. But rejecting that version can lead to something else if you're not careful. You start associating leadership itself with risk, with disruption, with stepping too far too fast. So you stay measured, you stay contained, you wait for something that feels completely justified before you move. What gets lost in that process is a quieter form of leadership that doesn't rely on force at all. It begins with recognizing that you don't need to create the moment. In many cases, the moment is already there. She has stayed. She has left space open. The interaction is not closed, it is simply undefined. And what she is responding to is not whether you can impress her, but whether you can give that undefined moment a direction that feels natural. This is where calm assertion comes in, not as a technique, but as a way of being present enough to act without overthinking the outcome. You are not trying to guarantee a result. You are responding to what is already happening with clarity instead of hesitation. That clarity doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be simple, almost understated, but it carries weight because it moves things forward. A slight shift in tone, a decision to extend the interaction instead of letting it fade, a moment where you choose to define what is otherwise left open. These are not high-risk moves. They are small acts of direction that signal something important, that you are comfortable taking responsibility for the next step. And that is what many men misunderstand. Leadership in this context is not about controlling the outcome. It is about being willing to influence it, to step in and shape the interaction instead of waiting for it to resolve itself. That willingness is felt immediately, not as pressure, but as presence. Because when a man moves with that kind of grounded clarity, it removes the ambiguity without removing the ease. It allows the interaction to evolve without forcing it into something artificial, and it gives her something to respond to, rather than something to guess about. This is why recognition alone is not enough. You can understand every subtle signal, notice every moment of lingering, read the situation accurately, and still leave it unchanged if you don't act on it. Awareness without movement becomes another form of hesitation, just more informed. What closes the gap is not boldness for its own sake, but the willingness to take a simple, appropriate step when the moment calls for it. And when you do that consistently, something shifts. You stop experiencing these interactions as uncertain or unclear, not because the signals become louder, but because your response becomes more aligned with what is actually being offered. The hesitation fades, not by force, but by replacement. You are no longer waiting for the moment to prove itself. You are meeting it halfway.